And now we're ready to turn over to our keynote speaker. Dr. Rita Cameron-Wedding was the Women's Studies Department Chair at Sacramento State University for 23 years and is currently a professor in the Department of Women's Studies and Ethnic Studies. As a faculty for the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, she has trained judges at court improvement initiatives in over 40 states. Dr. Cameron-Wedding's curriculum, Implicit Bias, Impact on Decision-Making, has been used to train judges, public defenders, practitioners in child welfare, juvenile justice, law enforcement, and education in jurisdictions throughout the United States. This she's been doing since 2005. Dr. Cameron-Wedding is currently developing security officer train the trainer curriculum to be taught in various parts of the world for a multinational technology company. Let us listen to Dr. Cameron-Wedding.
Good morning, everyone. It's certainly an honor to have this opportunity to speak with you this morning. I'm speaking with you from California. It's great to have a chance to connect and share ideas on this very, very important subject. So we've all been through one of the most tumultuous years of our lives, I'm sure. But like they say, with adversity comes opportunity. So I'm going to share with you today how I'm attempting to take advantage of this opportunity. I've been doing work in child welfare for quite some time. I started about 15 years ago as a trainer when child welfare professionals approached me and they asked me if I would look at their data on disproportionality. And I looked at the data, it was California data. I looked at the data and it showed a very stark disparity, particularly of African-American kids. And I couldn't explain that. I didn't understand it. I couldn't explain it. And so I had to really go deep into my own thinking about how could we have this degree of disproportionality and disparity without anyone seeming to notice it. So I started to do the research and I found out that even though we're all well-meaning people, even though the fact that we get up and we go to work and we do our best every day, we are still attending our work with certain perceptions and certain assumptions and certain biases about other people. And so I wanted to get to the bottom of that. So today I'm going to share with you a little bit about my journey. I'm going to frame the work on social determinants of health within my own experiences, because I think that it's valuable to understand that in order to understand the social determinants of health, we not only have to look at the individuals who are negatively impacted and in many cases disadvantaged by their own experiences and issues of disproportionality. But I also have to turn the focus and the spotlight on myself. I have to think about what can I do to make it differently. And so that's what I want to share with you. I want to share with you the opportunity we have to address the issue of social determinants of health and hopefully take the next step. Next. So this slide is a statement from the Supreme Court of California, and it's speaking to the idea that we have to go deeper. And I absolutely agree with that. As I pointed out before, I know that all of us are doing a great jobs where we sit. But I also think when I'm reflecting on my work, I figured out in 2020 that it's time for me to go a step deeper. When I first had my audiences in child welfare and I was talking about issues of disproportionality, I wouldn't dare talk about race, by the way, because I didn't feel like our community, I didn't feel like the child welfare agencies I was addressing or the judges I was speaking to, I didn't think we were ready for that. And that's how I got involved in implicit bias. I wanted to have a conversation with people that would allow me to talk about the hard stuff, but talk about it in a way that I could keep everybody at the table. So I would talk about implicit bias and I would explain implicit bias. And in the beginning, people were very, very uncomfortable and like, Like we said, this was about 15 years ago. People were very uncomfortable. I was uncomfortable. I found myself running to the grocery store after every training, buying 2 boxes of Haagen-Dazs bars. And I would eat, as you know, there are 3 in each box. I would eat at least 6 Haagen-Dazs bars on the way home. That's not a good thing, but that was my coping mechanism. So it was a hard conversation. Over time, over the years, I found that people got a little bit more comfortable to the point where instead of sitting in the trainings with their arms crossed, now they were willing to have the conversation to the point where we left it off in 2019. People were saying, yes, I have biases. And it was like this pronouncement, I have biases, which was great. It was great when you think about how we had transitioned from people not thinking they had biases to now owning them. But guess what? That is our starting point. That's not where we need to end up. Yes, we have biases. I have biases, and I grapple with my biases every day. But the next step, or the big question is, so what do I do with my biases? That's the most important question. Next. So now that I'm willing to accept, and now that many people are willing to accept that they have biases, let's go to the next step. Let's put the conversation about race back on the table. Because as I'm talking about, I will be talking about 3 systems that I believe will have a huge impact and have had a huge impact on people, most particularly children, in all of our communities. And those 3 systems are child welfare, juvenile justice, and education. So in order for us to really get behind and get beyond some of the disparate outcomes that we have experienced, we have to go deeper, and we have to be willing to talk about the driving factor of disproportionality, and that's racism. Yes, this is the hard conversation that we need to have. But one of the things that I owe to the pandemic and protests is the realization that if we really want to do better, if I really want to do better in my work, and if you want to do better in your work, the time is now for us to have the conversation. So the slide that I have up now is an interesting thing. It's about the fact that a young woman named Kennedy Mitchum wanted to have the Merriam-Webster dictionary re-examine the definition of race. Because what she said in her experience, that most people were challenging her about the meaning of racism, and they were saying that racism did not include systemic racism. And she wanted people to understand that, yes, it does. So Merriam-Webster actually agreed to change the definition to include a piece on systemic oppression or systemic racism. Next, please. So like I said, I definitely avoided talking about the hard stuff. And one of the things that we learned, that I even learned when, earlier this year, when we were listening to the issues and the calls about systemic racism, this is the thing. It's like people were so confused. I'm sure that you will agree. You may have been confused. It's like, what is systemic racism? Why can't I see it? If it's there, why can't I see it? I don't think it's there. So people were very perplexed by it. But the one thing that we know about systemic racism is the reason that it is so powerful is because we can't see it. It's so stealth. It can happen right before our very eyes, and we miss it every time. So the definition I have, and I want to read this because this is going to be very important to all of the pieces that I share with you in all the systems. So it's about those patterns, procedures, practices, and policies that operate within institutions in ways that intentionally or unintentionally consistently penalize and disadvantage individuals who are members of non-white racial and ethnic groups. So whether we're talking about child welfare, juvenile justice, education, all of us can use various forms of decision-making excuse me, that can contribute to systemic racism. So we need to talk about how that happens next. So the quote that I have up here now it's a quote by Judge Harry Blackmun. And in this quote, he says, in order to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. There is no other way. So this was part of his University of California versus Bakke around 1985. And so he was saying it then. So in order for us to really get this work done and get it done right, we have to talk about race. There is no other way. The other piece that's on the slide is some of the work that's come out in 2019, 2020 can change the landscape about how we talk about race. The next quote is, the opposite of racism isn't not racist, it's anti-racist. And the reason this is so important is because, I'm myself, I like to think of myself as being someone who's not racist, and I do the best I can. But I have noticed that sometimes when I'm working with students, I can and do, sadly and embarrassingly, have a different response to them on the basis of race. Where I sit in my decision-making ability, I can contribute to systemic racism when I respond to students differently based on their race, when I don't give them as much time as I have given a previous student, when I might unconsciously think their writing assignments aren't as good as somebody else who, is of a different race or ethnicity or of a different gender, for example. So I have to be mindful every day. I can't just say that I'm not racist. And this is what I'm saying to the groups that I speak to now. It has to be more than saying that I'm not racist. I need to think about the fact that I have to be intentional and work every day in all of my decision-making to be anti-racist. Next. So this slide, is about some data that is addressing the issue of disproportionality and disparities. And we're not getting the words on this particular slide, but I can just give you some information about what's going to be there as it shows up. So this is causing us to look at all of the various forms of data that reflects the fact that we have these disparities, particularly in the juvenile justice system. And this report came from the United Nations Racial Disparities in the US Criminal Justice System, 2018. I'm going to tell you why this is important. This is important because when we look at the slide, what we see are numbers of the rates, incarceration rates. And for people looking at these rates, it's really easy for us to say, oh, these people, they get in trouble at such huge rates. And, that's too bad. I'm sorry that they get in trouble, but let's figure out how we can fix them. And while that's true, a lot of, undoubtedly, groups of people, depending on who they are, depending on their, level of income, whether it's poverty, whether it's lack of education, all of these other social determinants of health, it's like they will need different things. But the other thing I want you to do when you look at this slide is I want you to think about all of the decision-making that has led from the experiences of children from the day that they become a part of the public sphere until they become adults. All of the decisions and how one decision will be compounded upon the next decision. So I want you to think about that. I also want you to think about the fact that we have made decisions as a country that have had a huge impact on individuals and their involvement in the criminal justice system. And one of those decisions, and not the least of them, by the way, is some of our policies around drugs. And so a lot of what you see in this slide is a reflection of the war on drugs all the way back to 1985. The reason that's important is because sometimes our drug policies, such as the war on drugs, have definitely pushed people farther and deeper into the criminal justice system. One example I can think of that, of course, is crack versus cocaine. And at one point, I think it had a 1-to-100 ratio. So as we are looking at this slide, I want you to think about that all of the decision-making individually and institutionally that has gone into the outcomes represented on the slide today. The next slide that we're going to look at, I want you to think about this slide. I want you to think about it from the point of view that the disparities, the decisions that we make don't just go away. They have long-lasting impact. And so I want you to consider this video. It's called Our Hidden Biases. I want you to look at this video and want you to think about it from the standpoint of all of the decisions that were made that have impacted the life of this child. We can begin the video.
Good morning. How are you?
Cool.
So, can we talk about how you got here?
Hey, you think I got a funny looking face? I just thought it was funny.
Hey kids, I'm telling you, go right here.
Man, we ain't doing nothing.
Go right here before I'm called cops.
So, you didn't do anything?
Nope.
Then what's all this?
Depends on who's reading it, I guess.
Well, looks broken. Skateboarding, huh?
Yes.
Is this the first time you've hurt yourself?
No, I get hurt all the time.
At home?
At home? He hurt himself skateboarding at the park.
Okay, ma'am. I'm gonna have a counselor come in and speak with you.
A counselor? For what? He's okay.
Well, I done told you them tricks were gonna put you in the hospital.
I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, too. A nurse will be in a few minutes to help you check out.
What's up?
That doctor thought I did this to him.
How you doing?
Hi.
It ain't fair.
Fair has nothing to do with this. This is about you taking responsibility for your actions. Look, I know so many young men just like you that didn't do anything. And yet, most of them are in prison.
You don't know me. I ain't going to no prison.
If you don't want to end up in prison, you're going to have to get some new priorities and probably some new friends, too. Look, you're not getting any younger. You need to get an education so you can get a good job.
Like you just like everybody else. You think you see, But you don't see. You see what you want to see.
I see what's in this folder. It shows me what you've been doing.
I ain't doing nothing.
I am not doing anything. Stop.
I ain't doing nothing.
I'm not doing anything. And yes, you were. Get to the timeout chair. Now, please. I'm sorry. I am so sorry.
Well, it's likely that all of us could see some of ourselves in that video. And once again, I want to stress the fact that this is not because we're bad people. It's just because I have been taught to see people in certain particular ways. I can see myself in that video in my attempt to do a good thing for a child. I may have said something or done something that has reinforced biases for them. So this is a slide that we see now that really speaks to the fact that we have a huge problem in our country with our criminal justice system, starting with youth, and in many cases, starting with children, with preschoolers even. This is a personal email that I received from a judge that I've worked with for a long time. And it says, as you can see, every time I visit a prison or a juvenile detention facility, I am struck by the numbers, the obscenely disproportionate numbers of Black inmates that we have here in Michigan. When I was in Texas about a year or so ago, one of the school administrators came up to me. We can go to the next slide. One of the school administrators came up to me, and one of the things he said, I just don't know what's happening. My students come in as students and they leave as felons. So essentially what we're learning from this is that anytime we have this degree of disproportionality and disparity, what we're looking at is systemic racism. Unless we believe that there is some innate qualities that groups of individuals have, if we believe that they are human and are the same as everybody else, then that means that there is something that we're doing in our system that is creating these different outcomes. So the next slide, not the next slide, sorry. The next thing I want to address is child welfare. Child welfare, as we know, is a very important system. It's essential to the health and well-being of our nation's children to have those decision makers there. But I want to share with you some examples of how biases can even show up in child welfare. Once again, people they have devoted their lives to helping people, but how biases can seep into that decision making. So I have two examples. One example is it was a child welfare agency, and this is not uncommon, as we know. But Black children and white children were equally as likely to have substantiated allegations, recurrence of maltreatment, and subsequent referrals. Black children yet were 25% more likely to enter foster care than white children, and 50% more likely to re-enter foster care. I asked the child welfare director if she could explain that data to me. I mean, this is the data that I've been listening to for 15 years. So I heard it in 2005. I'm hearing it now. This situation was only about a year ago. I said, can you explain to me why the substantiation rates are the same, but the outcomes, the fact that, this group of kids, they end up going into child welfare. And when you think about the fact that they're going into foster care, it's not just like they're going into foster care, their whole lives are disrupted for circumstances of other kids, similar circumstances of other kids, and they don't get placed out of home. So I just wanted people to think about the fact that, so we see trauma here. We see the lifelong impact of trauma. We see school impacts, the fact that these kids often get behind in school. They often have to go from one school to the next. And so we have to ask ourselves, so is this the only option? And when I ask, why do we have these racial disparities when the basis for the decision-making is the same? Child welfare director says, I don't know. So what I want us to do is to think about our decisions. Are we sure we don't know? Is it possible that it could be biased? In one child welfare agency I worked with, we asked them to do a survey. Can you do this survey and tell us why you have such a disproportionate amount of African-American kids in your system? And in response to the survey, the child welfare workers wrote, we have a disproportionate number of African-American kids in our system because, and I quote, Black families have poor parenting skills, unquote. So I want you to think about that. If people believe that Black families have poor parenting skills, if they believe that, can that impact their perception, their overall perceptions of Black families and their overall belief about the abilities of Black families to raise healthy children? The next example I have is family drug court policies. One child welfare agency realized that they were not adequately serving African-American women who were involved in child abuse and neglect cases. They eliminated the exclusionary criteria of prior domestic violence and significant mental health diagnosis. They realized then that white women who had been coming into the program with the same problems, but these problems were discovered after screening, and the women were allowed to proceed with acceptable outcomes. And as a result of that, they totally relaxed the screening criteria. And as a result of relaxing the screening criteria related to domestic violence and mental health, the percentage of African-American clients increased and their outcomes improved as well. But the point here is that this agency realized it because they did a personal audit. They looked at why do we have these disparities? So they started asking the questions about their own decision-making. When Black women were able to come into the program, they had the same positive, identical outcomes as the white families. The point is this: if we are colorblind, if we say we don't notice race, we're going to miss opportunities. Next slide. So this is the Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. I'm sure many of you have seen it. I'm sure many of you have read it. And it's an excellent book that explains the relationship and the ongoing 21st century impact of our criminal justice system. So the one thing I also wanted to note here is that we did some work for the U.S. Department of Justice several years back. And we went into one community in which it was one community in which the city was almost equally divided with white children and children of color, particularly African-American kids. One of the things I found extremely perplexing was the fact that the day that we went to look at the court, at Juvenile Hall, I should say, every single one of the kids who were in Juvenile Hall Every single one. Now, remember, it's a city that's almost evenly divided, but every child in juvenile hall that day was African American. And I actually asked the judges, how do you have a separate juvenile hall for white kids? You must, because otherwise you're saying to me that white kids don't get in trouble. Or you could be saying to me that the way the laws are applied and enforced might be different and in ways that may have a differential impact on Black kids. The other thing I want to add, I'm going to go back. Well, we don't have to change the slide, but I just want to make a couple of additional comments about child welfare. I want to talk about the fact that in child welfare, social class makes a huge difference on the outcomes. I think we all know that. White professional class families are presumed to make decisions that are in the best interest of their children. Poor families are often not assumed to have that same thing. I live in a neighborhood which, was part of my informal study. It's a neighborhood that my parents could not have bought a home in when we were young. Because it had racial restrictive covenants on it. So when you look at housing is one of those things that has a huge determinant on social outcomes. And so this is a community that's safe. It's a community that has sidewalks. It has all the benefits of a very healthy community. I would not have been able to grow up in this community when I was a kid because of the racial restrictions. And what I find in this community is that the families who are my neighbors, wonderful people, they get to do things that work out okay for their kids. But if those same things happen in poor neighborhoods, those kids would be subject to removal. And I'm not advocating for these things. I'm just saying that families are they change over time and they're different, but somehow mostly these kids grow up and they're okay. In my neighborhood, I could go outside right now and see, mothers with their jogging strollers. And I also know that sometimes, because I'm friends with these mothers, I see the Starbucks cups, and it's not just Starbucks coffee that they have in the cups, but it's like in poor neighborhoods, that is something that would not be allowable. It's like in my neighborhood, I've seen 5-year-old children in hot tubs unattended. I'm not advocating for that, please understand. But it's like the fact that in this neighborhood, it's considered the right and within the purview of the parents to make these decisions. Tree houses, which though they are cute, they look a little dangerous to me. At one point in my neighborhood, people were like, oh, I've got a wine cellar, a wine refrigerator, a wine of the month club at Trader Joe's. So all of these things are things that wealthy families get to talk about proudly. Poor families would never or rarely have that kind of excitement about the consumption of any alcohol. Otherwise, they would be suspect as being not good parents. The other things that influences outcomes in child welfare are the stereotypes about single parent homes. Not all single parent homes are bad. It's like we have to understand that I still have to deal with this in a lot of my trainings when people are assuming, oh my goodness, it's like, is that a broken home? Are your children by the same father if you're single? It's like people who live in public housing, all of these things matter. I experienced myself one time when I was doing some work in the Chicago area. I'm from the south suburbs of Chicago, obviously many years back, but I was doing some work within the last 10 years and with judges there. And I told them I was very happy to be a part of this. Thank you for inviting me. I love the idea that I can give back to my community. And one of the judges asked, very appropriately, well, where exactly are you from in the Chicagoland area? Where are you from? And I proudly said to him, I'm from Chicago Heights, because I was proud. The judge's response to me was, I never thought someone like you could be from a place like that. Needless to say, I was stunned by his saying that, because I never thought I was from a place like that. And again, my point here is, if you think of that community as a place like that, can that impact your decision-making when you get a family or a child before you on the bench who is from a, quote, place like that? Next, please. So I'm going to go through all of the things that make these biases, that reinforce these biases in me and others, and make them hard to see. So I want you to think of this as the fact that racism, though it seems like it was a thing of the past, it's not a thing of the past, but we can't see it because it's been transformed. I'm going to talk about 5 factors that I refer to as tools of modern racism, the first being implicit bias. Next. Implicit bias. We all have heard about implicit bias. All of you know what it is. But I'll just read this because it's important. Implicit bias refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that are outside of our awareness and affect our understanding. Next slide. So what the researchers tell us, that our biases are hardwired. It's like it's in our brain. It's what we've been taught. It's the way that we see other individuals. It's almost like, when you experience things that create fear, threat, and anxiety in you, like snakes or alligators. I couldn't think of another example. It's like our brain activates. And so when our brain activates, it causes us to respond. And the research says that our brains activate more. For white people, our brains activate more when they see African American faces than when they see Caucasian faces. That's what the research says. I would like to make an amendment to that and say, my brain activates like that. It's uncomfortable. I don't like to say it, and I kind of hedged when I just said it. But the reality is, I've been taught to see people who look like me differently. And if I don't work on that, if I don't pay attention to that, it's going to impact how I respond to people. Next. So the stereotypes, powerful information systems. And this is a point that I was trying to make. When I was standing in the hallway on the 5th floor where the women's studies offices were when I was a chair, and I had a student who came up, and it happened to be an African-American student. This African-American student happened to embody all of the biases and stereotypes that I have inside of me. It's like all the way from the way he dressed, the sagging pants, the dreadlocks, which I've had dreadlocks, but my brain was still activated. He also had tattoos. I'm working on the tattoo thing. Everybody in my family, including my 90-year-old mother, has a tattoo, but I'm a little bit behind the curve on that. So I'm working on that. So he had sagging pants. He had dreadlocks. He had tattoos. And last but not least, he had a grill. I don't know if you all are familiar with grills in Texas, but I suspect that you are. The point is this. I found myself standing in a particular way, looking at him very suspiciously. So in some ways, that image, the woman who was in the video, Our Hidden Biases, that thing that she was doing, I was doing that. But I caught myself, and that's the whole idea. My self-reflection allowed me to ask myself in the moment, why are you standing like that? Why are you looking at him like that? Why are you more fearful of this student than any other student who might come to the 5th floor of Amador Hall? And that allowed me to shift my body language and my behavior right away. So stereotypes can cause us to override the facts. Stereotypes have a huge impact on our decision making. When I'm doing trainings, as I've done trainings across the country, I've asked people many times to tell me the stereotypes of the 4 major race and ethnic groups. And they talk about Native Indigenous people, African American people, Latinx people, Asian American people, and that's great. But I intentionally rarely ask people to tell me the stereotypes about white people because I was so uncomfortable having that conversation. But every now and then there would be a very astute individual in the audience who noticed that, and they would call me on it. And they'd say, interesting that you didn't ask us to talk about the stereotypes of white people. And so I would have to then talk about that. But I also found another way of having that conversation. I start asking about the stereotypes of the all-American girl, because that's an iconic image that most people across the country are familiar with, the all-American girl. So people would go on and they would talk about just about every place. I mean, every place I would come up with the same, people would give me the same examples. All-American girl, happy, skinny, blue eyes, cheerleader, blonde. So we knew the image of the all-American girl, that iconic image, was a white image. And everything about her was described in a very positive way. Does that mean all white women are positive and happy and bubbly and safe and all of that? No, it doesn't. But the default is to that. That's where that stereotype starts. And thus white women benefit from that positive imagery, that positive iconic imagery that you are okay until proven otherwise. The opposite is true for Black women. The stereotypes about Black women: aggressive, hostile, boisterous, hypersexual. I have another slide on that. So that means, and apt to steal your purse in the grocery store or something like that. So those are the stereotypes that befall me. Have I ever stolen somebody's purse? Absolutely not. But that's where stereotypes about me will start. So I remember once I was in South Carolina and I said to the audience of social workers, I said, it is almost, this is after we had done this exercise, I said, it is almost as though we've all taken a class. I said, I get the same response about the all-American girl all over the country. I've even heard it in other countries, about the stereotypes. I said, I get the same response. I get the same examples over and over and over again. I said, it is almost as though we've all taken a class called the All-American Girl. And what one social worker raised her hand and she said, it's because that we take that class about the all-American girl and those positive attributes about that accrue to white women or white people every day. Next. Stereotypes are so impactful and well-known that in ways that link Black people to criminal activity, for example, that that anyone can surveil them. It's like we talk about this heightened scrutiny for living while Black, from random people who make 911 calls to report Black people for the most mundane things like children selling water in the park or barbecuing in the park, or Black people trying to cash their checks, or raking the leaves in their front yard, or bird watching in Central Park, or falling asleep in a common area at a prestigious university and having the police called on you, or having the police called on you in Starbucks. This is ubiquitous. It is all over the place, and it has an impact on people. It imposes trauma on people to the point where they look around and they're wondering, are they safe? That was a little rough. I'm not sure why, but that was a little rough. Next. So, having a positive attitude. So I'm sure some of you are saying, but I don't do that. I have friends who are Black or have friends who are Latinx. And I just want you to think about it from this perspective, that people may overlook their implicit biases because they don't have any ill will towards the group. But having a positive attitude about the group, such as Latinx people, and enjoying their culture does not immunize us from negative stereotypes. For example, one might have a positive overall attitude towards Blacks and still associate them with dangerousness or criminality, and Latinos, and still assume that they are undocumented. Next. So these are some of the stereotypes that I've already talked about, but on this slide, I just want you to know that the stereotypes lead to adverse decision-making. That's what I want you to understand, how powerful my stereotypes are and my assumptions about people will have an impact on them in a school setting, in a court setting, or on the street, as I just pointed out. Next, please. This slide basically does the same. It talks about the length of time, how stereotypes can contribute to the length of time that girls actually spend if they're in a juvenile justice situation. It also talks about school suspensions and expulsions. In some states, for example, for Black girls, like in California, we passed a law called the Crown Act because we discovered or realized that Black girls were easily discriminated against because of hairstyles. So that obviously is something for us to think about. Even that can have an impact. Next, please. So colorblindness. Colorblindness is a really powerful information system. Many of us have learned that or have been taught that we shouldn't talk about race. In fact, during the 80s, we really heavily controlled and monitored the public discourse on race. That's why that's why I've been reluctant to talk about it in my classes or my trainings, because the rules went like this. You shouldn't talk about race. You shouldn't think about race because race doesn't matter. And it also says whoever mentions race first is the racist in the room. So this is why we have a hard time getting people to talk about what should be really obvious to us, which is the fact that racial disproportionality is directly linked and tied to racism. But nobody wanted to deal with that because it's such an uncomfortable place for us to be. Colorblindness is a strategy that we've used that has impacted people regardless of whether we're talking about employment, housing, education, criminal justice, or any other setting. And some of you might even remember some of the language. It's like if you talked about race out loud, it's okay. We can go to the next slide. If we talked about race out loud, the assumption was we were playing the race card. So all of those things were controls on the conversation about race. So I want to show, microaggressions quickly. Microaggressions are really important for us to understand because these are things that are still happening every day. So when we think of racism, we typically think of those blatant and incontrovertible acts of discrimination like lynching or cross burning or whites only drinking fountains. I want you to think about racism in another way. There are things that I can do every day that can have a racist impact on other individuals. It's like what I did to my student that day in the hallway. And I still feel badly about that. By the way, my student did well. He ended up fine, not because of my response to him. And I should also note that turns out that he was an engineering major. And he was just there because he wanted to take a women's studies class as an elective. That was an aside. So microaggressions can be that behavior that I exhibited. It could be the way that I look at people, the way that I don't give people I might cut people off when they're talking. In child welfare and in other youth serving systems, microaggressions can include when you're talking with people and you're uncomfortable, the fact that it's, lack of eye contact or lack of attention or, just my body language that could convey something to people. It's the body language of my own body language that I described earlier. So we're going to show a very quick video, and I want you to think about whether or not you see yourself in this at all. Next slide. I want you to think about the video you just saw, and I want you to think about how and if that applies to you. The next thing I want to talk about is language. Language is an extremely powerful information system, obviously. Information is transmitted from one system to the other, from child welfare to juvenile justice to education, the language that we use, the way that we describe people. In this case, this is an image an image I've been showing for 15 years, by the way, and sadly, it's still relevant. What you're looking at is a picture of a 5-year-old. I refer to her as a baby girl, and in the time since this, I had a 5-year-old granddaughter at the time who's now I guess 20. I shouldn't try to count while I'm doing this. But anyway, so what we're looking at are 3 police officers who are standing over this 5-year-old little girl. And you are probably wondering, this is an educational setting. So what she did was she had a tantrum, and she had a tantrum, and they called the police. Mostly, we don't call the police when children are having tantrums. We try to resolve it in a less impactful way. But we've seen, unfortunately, many examples of people calling school officials and other authorities, calling the police for something that I think I would have tried to handle with, maybe some essential oil or a puppy or mental health professional to get her to calm down. But instead, what happened to this child, we added more trauma to her life. So let's look at language here. I call it a tantrum. The police officer who was involved in this called her behavior, which was a tantrum, an outburst of violence. Next slide. This is just the judge who was involved in this case. And again, we end up with a situation where when this goes to court, it's like now more language gets, it's legal language, it's charges that can apply to the child. Next slide. So when we're looking at, and I want to talk about the heading that I have here, quote, like toxins, language is deadly in small doses, unquote, by Supreme Court Justice Roberts. I think this is really important because all you have to do is drop a word, and if it connects to a stereotype, people will just run with it because that's how our brains work. So implicit bias can influence the words contained in case notes and court reports. So in situations where mothers are doing, this is in the white box, when mothers are making self-reports on their drug use. What judges have said to me is that they never noticed how language could change depending on the race or ethnicity of the individuals involved until they started working with implicit bias. And what they have found or noticed is that when the white mother is describing her drug involvement, as she tells the social worker that she has no involvement in drugs, it also often shows up on the reports as, quote, no drug involvement. When the mother is a Black mother and she's telling the social worker, I'm not using drugs, what often shows up in the court report is mother alleges no drug involvement. Next. So in courts, we see, a lot of many judges have said to me, I don't notice race. I just read what's in the court reports. But this is what I say, is that biases are embedded in school records, child welfare case notes, medical records, arrests, and court reports in ways that promote biases at every subsequent decision point. So even though we think we don't notice race, it's like when those words connect to the stereotype, they can inform and influence decision-making. Next. On this one, I just want people to think about the words that they choose to use. In this one, it was a situation in which, and this is something that social workers can think about. At the end of this is too long to read, but at the end of this, it's like Black students and Black and white people are involved in the same situation. It was a shoving situation. It was something that was like set up so that they could analyze it. And when the Black people were involved in the shoving, they called it shoving. When the white people were involved, they called it playing around. So again, how language will change depending on the people involved. Next. So the last slide is just to give us a chance to think about language, respect deficit language. And by that, I mean, are we being respectful when we talk to people? Are we talking down to them? Are we using words that they might perceive as offensive? So this is all just to get us to think about the power of language and the words that we use, the words that we choose, and how we interpret them. So finally, the last slide. This is what I want to leave you with. I want to leave you with some hope that we have power in our decision-making. I want you to know that we can change outcomes from where we sit. Just imagine what would happen if you were the gatekeeper to systemic racism and you had the power to end racism at your decision point. Well, you do, and I do. You can identify language that transmits bias from one decision point to the next. You can be aware of how stereotypes affect people, how people are perceived, treated, and believed. And you can notice how policies influenced by bias are applied and enforced and enforced in ways that can contribute to disparities at the next decision point. In this way, each of us can do something to end systemic racism. But remember, in order to do it, in order to end systemic racism at my decision point, I have to take account of race. There is no other way. Thank you all so much for your time. Thank you for participating. And I hope you got at least one thing out of this presentation that you can use. Thanks so much.